Hello, my name is Priyanka Fuda, and it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Helena DeBres. She is an assistant professor of philosophy at Wellesley College and received her PhD in philosophy from MIT in 2007, and afterwards was a postdoctorate fellow at Stanford University's Program on Global Justice. Her research focuses on the foundation and content of principles of distributive justice in global politics. She is also interested in moral philosophy, especially the nature of well-being and contemporary consequentialist theories. I was lucky enough to take a philosophy seminar with Professor DeBres last semester, and in retrospect, I realized that her very approach to teaching is very much in the spirit of the Institute. For example, during our unit on trade, our class bravely studied economic ideas like Pareto efficiency. I highly recommend taking a class with Professor DeBres. I found it a transformational experience. Without further ado, Professor Helena DeBres.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. It's lovely to be back at the Albright Institute. My talk today is going to be on global poverty. There's a little problem with my PowerPoint, but I'm going to just deal with that. So let me get started. When most of us think about global justice, the first and most disturbing problem that comes to mind is the existence of severe and widespread global poverty. So I'll just cite some representative statistics. These are from the latest edition of the Human Development Report, which is published annually by the United Nations Development Programme. About half of the world, that's 3 billion people, live on less than $2.50 a day, which is $900 a year. 1.1 billion people in developing countries lack adequate access to water and basic sanitation. Another 500 million on top of that have no access to electricity. About 1 billion children, that's almost half the children in the world, live in poverty. And around 22,000 of those children die each day as a result of poverty-related causes. When we're faced with these facts and others like them, a couple of obvious and urgent questions come to mind. So one is the question of how to explain the problem. So what are the causes of extreme poverty worldwide? Why are there so many poor people in some countries and fewer poor people in other countries? Next, sort of second question, maybe the most pressing one, there's this question about how to solve the problem. What measures are most likely to reduce severe global poverty worldwide? Is it greater integration into global markets? Is it increased aid dollars? Is it climate change mitigation maybe? Is it internal institutional reform? There's many different suggestions out there. And can foreigners help the global poor escape their situation? Or is it really just something that people within the countries that contain a lot of poor people have to sort of work out for themselves? Over the next few weeks, as you work on your projects and listen to lectures in the Albright Institute, you're going to be thinking about those sorts of questions a lot and discussing them with your fellow Albrighters. There's another question, though, too, that's less often explicitly addressed. It's going to be the subject of my talk this afternoon. So when we speak of global poverty as a problem and we talk about ways that we might solve that problem, what we're doing is assuming that its existence is troubling in some way. So there's something bothersome about this phenomenon. And we're assuming that we have a reason to do something about it. But why should we think that? Poverty is clearly a really bad problem for people who suffer it. But for most of us living in the rich world, it's not a personal problem in the sense that we're not the ones who are poor, right? So why is it a problem for us, where us or we means relatively affluent citizens of high-income countries? One reason for us to care about global poverty is a kind of narrowly self-interested one. So poor countries are the breeding grounds for many problems that can spill over the borders of rich countries. So, there's sort of crazed dictators, drug trafficking, major public health problems, economic crises. All of these things can end up being a direct problem for citizens of rich countries. But I think I can safely assume, given that we're at Wellesley and you're in the Albright Institute, that you're not just worried about global poverty for those reasons, right? So it's not just the narrowly self-interested concerns that bother you when you think about this problem. Most of us think that global poverty is also a really serious moral problem, so we have an ethical obligation to do something about it. But what kind of moral problem is it? Why exactly should we care about global poverty from a moral point of view? I think it's a good idea at this early stage of the Albright Institute to look at that more philosophical question head on as a way to kind of frame your discussions of some of the later questions that you'll be addressing. We're not going to come to a final answer on this question. They're pretty rare in philosophy. It drives my students insane. So we won't come to a final answer. But what I'm hoping to get you to do is think about some possible answers in the space and also sort of work towards your own view about this question. So the plan for my talk today is a simple one. I'm going to introduce you to two distinct answers that people have given to this question of why we should care about global poverty. And then we're going to talk together about some of the attractions and problems of those answers. There's actually a handout, so I've got to go through. So there's two answers that I'm going to discuss. A distinctive in that one of them is based on what's known as a positive duty to alleviate poverty, and the other one is based on what's known as a negative duty. A positive duty, as the name suggests, is a duty to do something active, so to perform some kind of positive action. And a negative duty is a duty to stop doing something, right? To cease performing some action or other. So those are the two types of duty we're going to discuss. And we'll see which of those is the best sort of way of looking at the problem. This first argument we're going to talk about is one of the most famous made in moral philosophy. It was first made by Peter Singer, who's up here on the screen. He's an Australian philosopher at Princeton. He wrote it, he presented it first in this 1972 article that I asked you to read, and he's also presented it again more recently in a book that came out in 2009. It's a full-length version of what is essentially the same argument. He hasn't really changed his mind about it. He's just updated it with some extra facts. It's a simple argument, and it can be quickly stated, so I'm going to walk you through it, and then we'll talk about what you think about it. The argument begins with two simple premises. You can see these on your handout that Singer assumes are widely shared. First premise, suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. Second premise, it's a philosophical way of saying claim. If it is in your power to prevent something bad from happening without sacrificing anything nearly as important, it's wrong not to do so. Those premises both seem pretty plausible. The first is maybe a little bit more obvious than the second, but the second looks pretty plausible too, right? So these are very appealing claims. The philosopher Bertrand Russell once claimed that the point of philosophy is to start out with something so simple as to not seem worth stating, and then end up with something so absurd that no one will believe it. And many people think that's what Singer does with this argument. So to see how he does it, let's look at what he does next. He presents two cases. This is the most memorable part of his paper. Case A and Case B. Case A asks you to imagine walking past a shallow pond, or we could call it the lake on campus. So you're walking past the lake, and you see a child drowning in it, flailing about, its little hands waving in the breeze, in the snow, I guess. Okay, so bad situation. Imagine you've just gone to J. Crew or Anthropology or Bloomingdale's or Barney's or something, and you've just bought yourself a fabulous new pair of pants. Right? And you know that if you jump into the lake, then you're going to ruin those pants. Right? They're made of fancy material that you spent a lot of money on, and you're not supposed to go swimming in them. What do? Do you stand there thinking, the child or the pants? The child or the pants? It's a really pressing moral dilemma. No, you don't, right? You don't. You immediately jump into the lake and you save this child that is going to drown if you just stay on the shore. Right? And why is that? It's because your pants are not anywhere near as important as the life of this child. In fact, they're not really morally significant at all. Right? Then Singer moves us on to the second case, right? Case B. So in this case, someone is dying of famine in a foreign country. She has no food or water. She's stricken by disease and malnutrition. You can send money to save this person through a reputable charity, or you can go to J. Crew or Anthropology or Barney's or Bloomingdale's and buy yourself this fabulous pair of pants. What should you do? Well, you want to be consistent and ask yourself the same questions, right? So are your pants as important as the life of this person dying of famine overseas? No, they're not, right? Again, the claim is supposed to be they're not, so you should send your money overseas to save this person rather than buying the pants. So that second conclusion, I'm calling it Claim B on the handout, that you should rescue the famine victim instead of buying your fancy pants, is much more controversial than Claim A, which said that you should rescue the drowning child. But all that's required to get to Claim B is those two premises we started with, premise 1 and premise 2, and then the addition of a third premise. Third premise on the handout is, by donating to aid agencies, you can prevent suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care without sacrificing anything nearly as important. Okay. Claim B might be a little bit distressing for those of us who love great pants, right? It's going to get worse. It's going to get a lot worse than the pants. The pants were the beginning of a wave of badness for us, because next Singer is going to add premise 4 in the argument. There are very many extremely poor people in the world, each of whom will suffer or die in the absence of aid donations. So that's how we get to what I've called Singer's startling conclusion. Until the day when global poverty is eradicated, if you don't donate all of your resources beyond those that you need to prevent serious suffering to yourself and your dependents, you are doing something seriously wrong. Why? Well, given the numbers of people in severe poverty around the world, you can't just give up your pants. You've also got to give up your grande mocha eggnog pumpkin spice lattes, right, that kept you going right the way through the fall. You've got to give up your Penguins of Madagascar movie tickets. You've got to give up your spring trip break to Miami. You've got to give up your collected works of Michel Foucault that you've been saving up to buy for ages. Maybe that Taylor Swift single that you want to buy on iTunes. I got a blank space, baby. You've got to give all that up, right? And what Singer is saying here in this conclusion is that it's seriously wrong to not do that. So the claim is not just that, well, it would be nice for you to send your money overseas and help these people who are suffering. It would be generous, be charitable of you to do that. Instead, he's saying, no, this is a really strict moral requirement. It's not optional. It's just as bad to fail to send your money as it is to, say, kill someone, you might say, right? So it's not something you should be praised for doing. So think about this for a moment. Each of us in this room is violating this requirement. Each of us is wearing clothes that are much nicer than they would be if we took this argument seriously. Each of us is planning weekend trips away or vacations that are a lot more luxurious or enjoyable than they would be if we took the argument seriously. So this is a very radical claim that Singer is arguing for. There's some good news here and there's some bad news. The good news, according to Singer, is that if every person who was relatively affluent in the rich world gave up just a small part of their income, we wouldn't have to worry about global poverty anymore, right? So he claims that if each of the 855 million rich people in the world gave $200 per year, that would total $171 billion, which is roughly the amount that the economist Jeffrey Sachs thinks is required to reach the Millennium Development Goals. So if everyone played their part, we wouldn't have to worry about this problem so much. You could start going back to J. Crew, you could buy your single, everything would be fine. The bad news, however, is that we know that very many people are not going to do this, right? Many people are going to continue to live pretty affluent, luxurious lifestyles. So what that means is that you're going to have to keep on taking up the slack for those people, and you're going to have to make the kind of sacrifices that would drastically reduce your own quality of life. Goodbye pants for you. I mean, you can wear some pants. They're not going to be very nice pants. They might be like the hand-me-down pants that your mother wore to her wedding in 1972 or something like that. Okay, so I want us to think about this argument together. We all find claim A very plausible. Again, that was the claim that you should rescue the child, even if you would ruin your pants. The results of taking claim B seriously, however, are really implausible to many people. But the same argument seems to get us to both claims. So how can we reconcile that tension? I'm going to ask you to talk about a couple of questions to get clear on this. There's these two questions. I'm going to ask you to turn to the person next to you and discuss them, and then we'll discuss them together. First question, I'm asking you to look at these two cases and think about whether there might be some salient differences between the drowning child case and the famine victim case that could justify kind of treating them differently? Right? That's the first question. Second question is if we do have this duty to make sacrifices for the sake of the global poor, what kind of practical difficulties do you imagine arising in our attempt to do that? And do those practical difficulties pose some kind of problem for the argument that Singer is making? The two questions may be related in ways that will come out in the discussion. Are there any questions before we move on about this? Okay, I'm going to give you about 5 minutes or so to talk to the person next to you about this, and we'll come back together. Okay, all right. You can stop now. I see you have a lot to say, which is great. So let's talk about this together, starting with the first question. So did you think of any differences between these two cases that might justify the claim that saving the child is required, but sending money overseas till you're very poor yourself is not? Yes, what's your name?
Hi, I'm Emma. We were talking about how when you jump in the lake to save the child, you know that what you're doing is going to save the child's life, whereas when you give money to a charity, you don't know that all that money is going to save a life, and you have no way of guaranteeing that your money is going to save a life. So you don't know that you're actually saving a life by giving money. Whereas when you jump in the lake, you know that you can do it, and you also know that you're the only person who can do it, whereas when you give to a charity, you assume that lots of other people are also giving.
Yeah, let's separate those two out, right? So the first worry is that there's a lot more, first suggestion, there's a lot more uncertainty in the case of the famine victim than there is in the case of the child, right? So who else was worried about this, right? Yeah, so you'll have worries about just how effective international aid organizations are, right? What are the kinds of worries that you have about international aid organizations? Yeah.
Corruption.
Yeah, corruption.
Is the money actually going to the field, or are they actually implementing the projects the way that they say they are?
Okay, good. Corruption. Other suggestions? Yeah.
Just poor design. So, are you going to plant a whole bunch of eucalyptus trees at the top of a hill and dry up all? Oh, sorry.
Eucalyptus trees.
Poor design.
Yeah.
So, if you I had an experience, but where you plant a whole bunch of eucalyptus trees at the top of a hill and dry up all of the water, then, that's going to make it worse, even if it's preventing deforestation.
Yeah, good. So people can be very well-meaning but not be very good at doing what they're trying to do. Any other worries? Yes. Sorry.
Longevity. So are you providing for a day, or are you providing seeds to grow food for years?
Okay, good. So often there's a worry that aid organizations are involved in sort of stopgap measures rather than long-term change. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Also, where the money's going to. Like, I know when we give money to organizations that give aid to Africa for food, sometimes it goes straight into the hands of the dictators who are preventing that aid from getting to the people we were hoping to help.
Yeah, so that's bad, right? That's even worse. So the concern is not just that these efforts are failing, but they might be perverse. They might be having exactly the wrong kind of effect. Right, Bridget?
There's also an inadequacy of information too. Like in the one case, the onus sort of falls on you because you have the opportunity to go and help the drowning child. But in the other example, you could be assuming that like thousands of other people are donating. So what good would my money do to the cause?
Right, the drop in the ocean worry, right? So I wanted to give you some info about the sort of aid organization question, or at least one reason that Singer thinks we shouldn't worry about it so much. So there are now these organizations that are engaged in trying to assess the effectiveness of different international aid sort of charities. So there's a website called givewell.org that Singer refers to in his book, which has various criteria for ranking different charities according to their likely effectiveness in actually reaching the goals that they're going for. So the main criteria, you can see them up here, are evidence-based change, very cost-effective activities, so charities that don't sort of divert too much money to sort of administrative costs, but actually produce really useful change. There's a worry about saturation, too much money going to too few sort of organisations, so room for more funding, and then transparency and accountability, which is supposed to sort of deal with your concern. So this organisation has ranked a bunch of charities and has come up with these three as being the best overall. The Against Malaria Foundation, Give Directly, a sort of direct transfer of cash, and the Schistosomiasis Control Initiative. I don't think I said that right. So there is an awareness of this kind of worry, and Singer thinks that if we are careful about where we send our money, we should be less concerned about those really important concerns that you've mentioned than maybe it seems at first glance. So this may not be totally reassuring, but it's supposed to ease at least some of those worries. What about some other analogies or disanalogies that we could turn to sort of put some pressure on the argument?
So what we were talking about was a little bit about proximity, and just how in that situation with the drowning child, you're right there in front of the child, whereas in the other situation, you're so far away from that child.
Yeah, good. So one clear difference is this one of proximity versus distance. Does that seem to be a morally relevant difference for you? Does it make a difference to our obligation?
I think it can be to people, certain people. It depends, though, on whether or not you feel that distance.
Yeah, what would Singer say to this suggestion? I'll take someone new. Yeah.
I think.
Hi, I think if we really want to be impartial and equal to everyone, the distance shouldn't make a difference. You should save the victim near or far.
Yeah, right. So Singer thinks, yeah, as a psychological matter, it seems to matter a lot that this person is right next to you as opposed to in some foreign country. But he doesn't think that from a moral perspective that should matter at all, right? It's a fact about us, but it doesn't reflect moral truth in any way. We're just being distracted by this tendency we have to pay more attention to things that are right in front of us. Is there another difference you could point to that might seem to be more important? Yeah.
So assuming that the child doesn't fall in the water every day and start drowning, there's definitely a disparity between like a singular event of a child drowning versus somebody who's starving, who probably has been starving for their entire life and will continue to starve. So looking at how if like we're using the exact analogy of like the pants, like is one pair of pants equivalent to like saving the child once versus like paying for someone to eat for their entire life?
Yeah, okay. So you could imagine a variation on case A where we just have a really clumsy child, right? So you're walking across the Wellesley campus every day on the way to your classes, and the same child keeps falling in the lake every day, right, over and over. And the first week or a couple of months or something, yeah, you ruin your pants, but you get to a point where you're just, I can't keep on ruining my pants for this child who keeps falling into the lake, right? So that suggests that there's something about the sort of iteration of the problem, or the repetitious nature of the problem in the global case that matters to our assessment of the obligation, right? It's very rare that you come across a child drowning or someone in immediate danger, but it's not very rare that you come across, at least in this abstract way, all these people dying overseas, and it seems to matter, right? Why do you think it matters? Why does it matter? What's the moral relevance of the fact that this thing is happening many times in one case and not so much in the other? Yeah.
I think it is kind of the argument that the poverty is a symptom of something and we're not actually getting at the root cause. So if we just keep sending money, it won't actually solve the problem in the long term. I guess it goes back to Alex's longevity argument.
Yeah, although you could say, right, that maybe not enough has been done yet to solve the problem, right? So it's not so much an indication that we're trying to solve the problem, we somehow can't, but actually a lot more could be done than has so far been done, right? Mm-hmm. A lot of the reason that people worry about the fact that in the child case there's just this one instance, and in the global case there's many, many instances, is that it's just so much more demanding, right, to solve the global poverty problem than it is to save the child. So what's really bothering people is the demandingness of the duty once you start going beyond these rarer cases. So one really common line of criticism for Singer is just to say there are limits on what morality can demand of us, right? We shouldn't have to be foregoing huge amounts of our own sort of self-interest in projects and relationships in order to help people who we have never met and will never meet. Right? So it becomes not so much a practical concern then, one about effectiveness, but a deeper moral concern about the extent to which we have duties to help people who we don't know. Right? So that's an important line of questioning. What would Singer say in response to that? If someone just said, look, in the case of the famine victim, this ends up just being way too demanding a duty, so we don't have the duty. what would he say? Is that a good reason to think that we ought not to send our money overseas? See some shaking of the heads? Yeah.
I think you'd say that duty is less about kind of ease and more about justice. So even though it's difficult, if we know that it's the just thing to do, then we should do it regardless.
Yeah, he would say, suck it up, friends. That's what morality demands. You know, we didn't come into this thing thinking that morality was going to be easy, right? It's difficult. Hopefully things will get better as people start complying with their obligations. But morality could just be really tough. So he doesn't think that's a very good reason to reject the duty. So we've seen two different types of arguments just in this sort of short discussion that you might make in response to Singer. One is a kind of practical line of argument, a concern about the effectiveness of aid donations. What Singer will tend to say in response to that, and supporters of Singer, is that maybe it's the case that particular forms of assisting the global poor are not going to work very well. Maybe sending money over is not a very good way to do it, for instance. So it was a useful kind of strategy to use for the article. But what really matters is not the specific way that we fulfill this duty via aid donations, say, but the more fundamental claim that we need to do whatever it is we can do that would help. And that might not be sending checks overseas. You know, it might be instead engaging in political activism, right? So trying to change rich country foreign policy with respect to poor countries. So maybe we should be focusing on campaigning for better trade policy or better immigration policy. Cease exploiting countries overseas. So the distinction there is between the fundamental duty, which is to help, and then the more specific sort of duties that you might derive from that. So he's going to say these worries about effectiveness are sort of a red herring. They don't disturb the main focus of the argument. And then there's a second kind of worry, which is more moral in nature, and just says, let's set aside the effectiveness concern. It's not required of us to engage in this extensive a sacrifice for people we don't know. A lot of people feel the force of that second concern, so what I'm going to do now is move on to the second broad type of argument you might make for why we ought to help the global poor, that tries to be less demanding than Singer's while still getting the kind of result that Singer wants us to get. Okay, so if you flip over to the other side of your handout now. The second argument is made by this man here, Thomas Pogge. He's a philosopher. He's now at Yale. The key feature of Pogge's approach, as I highlighted earlier, is that he doesn't base his argument on a positive duty to assist the global poor, so to give or to do something active. Instead, he bases it on a negative duty, a duty to cease doing something. So a duty, Pogge argues, to cease harming the global poor in the way that we currently are. So again, the argument can be stated pretty simply. It's there on the back of your handout. It starts with a moral premise that says that we have a negative duty not to harm others. So if we can avoid it, we should neither contribute to nor benefit from burdens suffered by other people. So the do no harm principle is fairly widely endorsed. Second premise, there exists a global order that is imposed by the global affluent on the global poor. So there's a quote on the handout there about what this global order is supposed to involve. It comprises a set of convention-based rules, treaty rules, about such matters as security, trade, property rights, human rights, and the environment. Other rules that govern global rule makers, the World Bank, the IMF, the United Nations, and so on. The whole system of territorial sovereignty is an institution. It's part of the global order. And then the various policies that are adopted by different transnational governance organizations, such as the WTO, and then the foreign policies of the world's most powerful states. So the global order is this complex of institutions that we can find internationally. Third premise, most of the global poverty problem, according to Pogge, could be eliminated through minor modifications in that global order. You might be thinking, like what? What are these minor modifications? One of the things that Pogge likes to use as an example is the international resource privilege that's built into international law. So this is the feature of international law that says that anyone who's able to gain coercive control over a territory is legally authorized to sell off the resources in that territory. So someone manages to get control of the Congo, perhaps by illegitimate means, they will then be able to sell off the oil and other resources found within the Congo. Why is this bad? Well, partly it's bad because those resources belong to the Congolese people, but also the dictator can then use those resources to further oppress his population, cement his rule. Similarly, there's something known as the international borrowing privilege, which says that, again, whoever is able to gain coercive control over a population in a territory is entitled to borrow funds on international markets on behalf of that country. And again, this is bad because it provides resources to people who do bad things with those resources. And also it saddles the country with debt that the dictator or the ruler himself won't need to pay back, but the people will later on. So what could we do about this? Pogge says, well, it's pretty simple. We could just cease to treat coercive ownership over a territory as legitimate grounds for selling resources and borrowing funds, right? So we could change international law to prevent that from happening. Right? It's a minor modification, he says, but it would have a huge effect on the incidence of global poverty in the world. Other modifications he talks about are an end to agricultural protectionism in the OECD, a relaxation of intellectual property protections, particularly for pharmaceuticals that would address the disease burden in developing countries. And he says these sorts of things are not going to result in major sacrifices for people in the rich world. So they would entail at most slight reductions in the incomes of the affluent. And so by failing to make these modifications, the global affluent are harming the global poor. The notion of harm that he has in mind here is slightly tricky, so I'm just going to talk about that briefly before we discuss the argument in more detail. So harm is a comparative concept. If you say that you're harming someone, what you're doing is you're making them worse off. So you need to ask yourself, well, worse off in comparison to what? What's the alternative state of affairs that we're comparing their current situation to when you harm them? There's two main options. First, Pogge might be making what's known as a diachronic comparison. And so there, if you say that the global affluent are harming the global poor, I'll just use this board, you're saying that they're making them worse off than they were at some earlier time. So it's a time-based notion of harm. So you're saying, under this diachronic interpretation, that we'll use 1900 as the beginning. In 2014, the global poor are worse off than they were in 1900, right? It's fairly straightforward. So poverty was bad here, and then it's even worse here. That will be one way of harming the global poor over time. Problem with this is that actually this is false, right? Actually, we have made some dent in the global poverty problem over the past century. So actually, things are better, a little bit better anyway, on most measures than they were in 1900. So that doesn't seem to work for Pogge. So we need a different concept of harm to make sense of what he's saying. And this is what he calls the synchronic conception of harm, which really just means the absent, the negative of the time-based concept of harm. So it's not to do with harm in the sense of making someone worse off than they used to be. Instead, the notion of harm that he's operating with is this idea that there's an alternative state of affairs that would be better for the global poor than the state of affairs that they have now, right? So here, we're thinking about an alternative global order. Call it 2000, it's actually 2015, isn't it? Yeah, I'm a little behind. 2015, we'll call it B. So the claim is that there's an alternative accessible global order, 2015B, that would be even better for the poor. So the fact that we have 2015 as opposed to 2015B, oh yes, that is right, means that we're harming the poor in that non-sort of historical sense. Is that clear enough? Yeah? Okay. Belabored a little, but it's important for getting clear on what it is that he's saying. So, Pogge is claiming that synchronically the global poor have been harmed by the global affluent. His final claim is that you in this room yourself are participating in this process. right? So as someone who is yourself heavily implicated in the global order, you're living amongst it, you're participating in it and benefiting from it, contributing to it in various ways, you personally are responsible or culpable for the harm that it's causing. Okay? So that's his final premise. Let me highlight two key features of this argument for you. The first, as I noted earlier, is that it's based on a negative duty, not a positive duty. So Pogge believes we do have positive duties to help the global poor. So we do have to do some things to help them in the way of positive actions. But he thinks that those positive duties are much weaker in general than negative duties are. So he agrees that we shouldn't be asked to make huge sacrifices for people. But he does think that it's very, very important that we don't harm people, right? This negative duty is a much stronger, more stringent duty than positive duties ever are. So he's not denying we have positive duties, he's just saying that the negative duties are more important. So he thinks we're more likely to take global poverty seriously if we take the negative duty line. Second clarification is that Pogge is concerned throughout on what effect the global order is having on the global poor. So he's concerned with international factors that explain global poverty. He's not denying that domestic factors also play a role. So sure, some things within countries make poverty worse. But he thinks that the global factors just have this overwhelming importance. So again, he wants to emphasize that aspect of the problem. Again, I'm going to stop now. I'm going to give you 5 minutes to talk about this with the person next to you. We've got some questions for you to focus on. First, I want you to talk about Pogge's conclusion, which again is pretty startling. The claim that you personally share moral responsibility for the deaths of millions of poor people. There's a quote there that makes that vivid. Do you agree that you yourself are responsible in that way? And then if you don't agree with that conclusion, where do you think the argument goes wrong? There's going to have to be something wrong either with the individual premises in the argument, one of those claims has got to be at fault, or else there has to be something wrong in the way that the argument gets from those claims to its conclusion. So there's something wrong with the logic of the argument. Okay. So what do you think about those questions? Again, I'll give you 5 minutes. Are there any questions of clarification before we do that? Okay, all right, go to it. Okay, all right, let's talk about this together. So who in this room agrees with Pogge that they're personally responsible for the death of millions of poor people? Bridget, a little bit? Yeah, okay, so a few of you are persuaded, right? It's not a pleasant conclusion, but, you know, sometimes the world is not pleasant, right? So maybe about a third to a half of you find this claim fairly plausible. What about those of you who don't? What is holding you back from endorsing this conclusion other than an aversion to it? Right, what do you think is wrong with the argument? Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
Sorry, we're told to use this thing.
Okay.
One thing that I wasn't really sure about is the third premise. Like, how do we know that the global poverty problems will necessarily be eliminated through those modifications? So one thing that we talked about was, for example, the rigid intellectual property protection for pharmaceutical companies. If we remove those, how do the companies still have incentive to invest in R&D, like research and development for, like, say, AIDS drugs? And if these modifications don't improve the global order, how do we know that we're not actually harming someone? Like the alternative state of affairs won't necessarily be better instead of worse.
Yeah, so 2015B could be even worse than 2015A.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, good. So good. So this is an empirical premise of the argument, right? So Pogge is making a positive claim about the world. Philosophers tend to try and avoid making too many of those in their arguments, or at least they're not really very well placed to support them substantially, right? Philosophers are not social scientists. So even though Pogge is actually much better informed about the world than many philosophers are, he's actually pretty well versed in development economics and economic theory in general. He doesn't provide in his paper and his books the really detailed sort of social scientific investigations or evidence that he would need to really support that claim. So it's reasonable to worry about whether it's really possible to substantially back up this strong empirical claim. turns out that it's really complicated to work out what would improve global poverty, right? And it's not as if there's just a solution out there we can easily just sort of plug into our moral arguments in that way. Good, so one place that you could kind of jump in is questioning that empirical premise. It's very unclear what exactly we ought to do and whether we could fix things through these particular kinds of institutional changes that Pogge has in mind. Okay, any other worries about the argument, other parts of it that seem a bit shaky? Lydia?
Yeah. I also have a problem with premise 3 in that I'm not entirely convinced that every individual has the same capability to make these modifications in the global order, and perhaps more responsibility should fall on those that have the power to do so.
Yeah, good. So that sounds more like a concern about premise 6, maybe, of the argument, right?
Yeah, maybe that too.
Throw in that as well, right?
Yeah,
So
why not?
that's the one that claims that you yourself, as an affluent person, are culpably complicit in this harm. It could be that you don't have very much opportunity to affect the global order, right? In which case, the responsibility would mainly lie with people other than you. It sounded like that was the line that you were taking. Yes?
But then I also kind of think, like, at the same time, you know, I'm voting for people, I'm buying clothes that, you know, were made in, you know, not great circumstances. So I think that there is, to some extent, a responsibility on the tiny individual. Like it's kind of, I think we would have to define what we mean by like complicity and approval, but I don't think that the onus should fall on the individual as much as someone who has more power or structural kind of things.
Yeah, so maybe what Pogge can say is he can agree that there are degrees of responsibility here, that people who have great power to affect the global order directly, policymakers and politicians and so on, diplomats, people in these transnational governance organizations have more responsibility than the average person. But that doesn't absolve you, Lydia, from your role in the system, because you are actively engaged in many ways. And as you pointed out, you could be more engaged, right? You could be doing a lot more. Well, I know nothing about your life, Lydia. I'm sure you're wonderful. You could possibly do a little more to sort of campaign for global political change than you're doing already through being an Albright fellow. I don't know. Yeah. Okay, so there are reasons to worry about that particular conclusion. Is there anything else about the argument that bothers you? Yeah, Hara.
He says in premise 1 that, in particular, if we can help it, we ought to neither contribute or benefit from this. But you could argue that we can't help the fact that we exist in these global systems that he talks about. That could be down to chance or luck. And then if you think some people can help it more or less, kind of going back to Lydia's point.
Yeah, good. Okay. So you could be engaged in this project kind of willy-nilly without much control on your own part. You could even be actively sort of protesting against it, right? So you might not want to be implicated as much as you are in the global order. And that would seem to affect, or it should affect, our assessment of how culpable you are. That's a good point too. Mm-hmm.
Related to that, like with the not being able to help it, like for instance, things like fair trade coffee and stuff, we can argue that, you know, morally everyone should buy those things, but then not everyone has the same financial capability even within a rich country, and so you might not be able to afford that, and so you might not be able to help perpetuating those systems, but it's not really your fault.
Yeah.
You.
I mean, one thing that Pogge and Singer both do, it didn't come through as much in my presentation, is they do primarily direct their arguments against the average sort of affluent person, right? So they're not claiming that if you're already very poor, even though you're in a rich country, that you ought to be giving away huge amounts of your stuff. You don't have much stuff to give, right? So the argument will be relativized a little in that way to try and deal with that concern. It's a good one. Any other concerns? Yes, Catherine? Yeah.
Catherine. So one thing we talked about was sort of like if this idea was taken to an extreme, you would have maybe a stagnation of progress, because like every action you do, you could find a negative effect, from turning on a light to like buying food in the grocery store. So like it would be a paralyzing condition to buy into this idea.
Why do you think that? I mean, I think you're hitting somewhere important there, but all, what he's saying is we need to make minor modifications in the global order.
Well, because he says you shouldn't. Maybe I'm misunderstanding, but I understood that like you aren't supposed to do any action that would have a negative effect on others or that would harm others. So if you consider that if you're contributing to global warming, then you're having a negative effect on others. So you can't do any action that would contribute to global warming, or like you can't buy from any company that doesn't treat workers well.
Yeah, good. You know, there's a really worrying problem here that I think your comment connects to, which relates to this particular notion of harm that Pogge is using, right? So as I said before, his notion of harm is that you're harming someone if they're in a state of affairs that could be better if you treated them differently, right? So take this example. Right now, I could be giving each of you a lovely cupcake with a little cherry on top of it, right? But I'm not doing that because I don't feel like it. So I'm not giving you a cupcake. You'd be better off if I gave you the cupcake. It sort of sounds like Pogge's notion of harm is going to have to say that I'm harming you by virtue of not giving you that cupcake, right? Because there's a state of affairs that's accessible from this one where you would be better off that I'm failing to create. Does everyone see how that's similar to what he's saying? But it really doesn't seem plausible to say that I'm harming you right now by not giving you a cupcake. Right? So some people are worried about Pogge's argument because they say that this notion of harm that he's working with is not very plausible. It's a real stretch of our usual understanding of what it is to harm people. Right? And if it doesn't work in the cupcake case, maybe it's not going to work in the global poverty case either. Right? There's one way of thinking about what Pogge is doing where you say that this is presented as a negative duty, do not harm the global poor. But really, it's just a positive duty in drag, right? So it's really a duty very much like Singer's, which says that you ought to be making the world a better place for the global poor. You ought to be helping them in a positive way. Your failure to do that involves harming them, but it's hard to see what the real difference is between those views once you understand harm in this way. You see what the problem could be there? So there's this concern that Pogge is trying to sort of deal with the problems of Singer's argument and ends up making an argument that sounds a little like Singer's. Who wants to keep pumping the Pogge line at this point? These are just some worries that you can raise, but it's still a very popular view. Who would like to try and defend Pogge against that worry? Bridget, go for it.
Well, I mean, it's sort of, this has sort of already been said.
But I think both Pogge and Singer's arguments sort of are a compelling call to action that everyone has the agency to do something in some way to either not harm someone or to act positively and make a difference. And I think that's a compelling argument and a great conclusion to arrive at, even if it sort of is phrased in this sort of negative way.
Yeah, so Pogge sometimes says that, you know, in private conversation, that even though he does strongly believe in positive duties, he thinks that it's much more effective sort of rhetorically or politically to make the negative duty argument. If you really care about the global poor, maybe you should be making the argument that is most likely to get people interested in the problem, right? So you could think of it that way. Mm-hmm.
I guess while he has many difficult points, my defense of him would be that since he's bringing up this point, more people can think about as an individual duty, and that will help define it more as a group duty, even though it's very vague. What do you do to not harm people? If there's more consensus later, then maybe more people can get behind it, and we can work on not feeling like everyone is self-sacrificing, the people who are buying in a lot versus the people who are buying in only a little bit.
Good, yeah. So you can think of it more as a collective project, even if the duty of any particular individual might be hard to trace. Good. Mm-hmm.
So earlier we mentioned that, or some people mentioned that as an individual we might not have as much power to actually affect change, and really those who are in positions of power are the ones who should take responsibility to make change. But I worry about that because their position of power is based on a series of practices of inequality and exclusion. Like if they represent some sort of institution that is perpetuating global poverty and these like practices of inequality, And so in that sense, I think it's really important that individuals examine the ways that we are like complicit in, perpetuating those things. So whether it's boycotting, I mean, I think consumerism, not to like be anti-capitalist or anything, but I think that capitalism can be, there are these big systems in place that are like really pervasive, very systemic, and really hard for the individual to transcend, because like, how am I not meant to go to the pharmacy and buy the medicines that I need? But it's just like re-examining the ways that we might be participating in those, and then, I don't know, boycott, start a revolution.
Yeah. I mean, both these arguments can be seen as, even though problematic in various ways, as empowering in that sense, right? They're both claiming that you as an individual have the power to do something about this really serious problem, maybe as part of a larger collective, but you're not absolved from responsibility just by virtue of the fact that you're in this complex system that you can't fully control. So that's important. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Taylor. I think one thing that's important to consider is that if you were designing a society, and this is, by the way, not at all my original thought, if you were designing a society and you didn't know where you were going to fall, and half of the world is in extreme poverty, you would want to be in a society where if you were placed into extreme poverty, someone would be able to help you. You would want the other people to come to your aid. So when we're thinking about the way we want the world to work, we should assume not that we're born into the places where we've had the luck to be affluent, but that, what's the worst situation that we could have been in? And we want to make sure that even the worst situation isn't without hope.
Yeah, that's really good, right? So in a way, that's a distinct kind of argument that we didn't discuss today, but a concern about fairness, right? And treating others the way that you would like to be treated if you were in their position. Right? Neither of these arguments really focus on that particular kind of concern, but it's another really important thread in the argument. So that's important. Okay. Before I move on to my little wrap-up, who here thinks that they probably, if they had to choose between these arguments, they'd be more pro going with Singer's argument than Pogge's? Who's a Singer fan at this point? Yeah, okay. Pogge, who's going to support Pogge in that competition? Maybe a few more? Right, yeah. Singer always has that problem. But as I said, maybe Pogge has it too. It's not clear how distinct the sacrifices would be in the end. We'd have to sort of find out. Okay, so we've looked at these two different answers to the question, why should we care about global poverty? One claims that we should care because we have a positive moral duty to assist people who are suffering deprivation, if we can do so without sacrificing something as important. And another one claims that we should care because we have a negative moral duty not to harm others, and that as rich participants in the global order, we are harming very many people. So we saw some difficulties with each of those answers. The first one, the Singer one, seems to have extraordinarily demanding implications. And the second one seems to rely on both empirical or positive claims and moral claims that require more support than Pogge gives them. So what should we conclude about this? I'm going to leave you worrying about what we should conclude about that. So we need to keep on thinking about that broader moral question. Instead, I'm going to make a methodological point about the relationship between philosophy and social science that I hope you can also think about going forward. So the three questions that I began with, how can we explain global poverty? How can we solve it? Why should we care about it? They're not as independent as you might think, right, or as you might have thought coming in. It turns out that we can't work out what our moral duties are in this area until we know more about what causes global poverty and how we can solve it. Both Singer and Pogge tend to imply that we know what we need to do to solve global poverty, and we just need to kind of muster the willpower to do it. Right? So we've got the answer, we've just got to really commit ourselves to it finally. But explaining and solving global poverty is actually a really complicated and difficult empirical task. So we can't really know what we ought to do morally until we've worked out what we can do as an empirical matter. Right? So these things are more closely tied together than they might seem. So that's one way of saying that philosophy needs social science to get all the way to its conclusions. But if it's true that philosophy needs social science, it's also true that social science needs philosophy, right? This is my kind of job pitch, right? Why am I here? Why am I doing philosophy? Social science can answer lots of really important questions that we have about this issue and other global problems. But even when all the facts are in, we've got all the data we need and all the theories that we need in that area, there's still going to be really pressing moral questions that we need to answer. So we need to answer questions about just how much we can reasonably be asked to sacrifice for people that we haven't met and that we will never meet. And we also need to answer questions about why we should consider their concerns our own concerns, right? What is it about their suffering or their pain or their deprivation or the injustice that they're under that gives us an obligation to do something about it? So if we want to persuade people to do something useful and effective and sustainable about global poverty and other global challenges, then we need to find a compelling answer to those questions too. They're a really important part of the equation. So I'll just end by saying that I hope that you Albright Fellows will continue to think about those questions as you make the most of this wonderful opportunity that you have going forward over the next few weeks.